Yeah, so my name's Javier Leiva. I'm actually a former student of Kristen's. I graduated in 2003 with a focus in broadcast journalism, which I'm sure that's what you guys are doing. And honest to God, I had no idea where my career would take me when I was sitting where you guys are today. I mean, my first gig actually was while being a student at USF, I was working at the TV studio on campus at WUSF. And my job was really just to be a production assistant, like hang lights. And I was really terrible at the actual production stuff, but I did the, the PBS begathons. I would hold the camera, even though the camera never moved. I never understood why they had us hold the camera that never moved. But I noticed that there was a producer there. His name was Ken Sherry, and his job was cool. I wanted his job. He had the job where he could make local documentaries, and I was like, wow. That's really neat. So, in between like studio gigs, I would say, hey, Ken, do you have anything that you want me to transcribe? Like I always offered myself up to help him, and he's like, oh, yeah, sure. So he would hand me a bunch of beta tapes and I would transcribe them, like by hand. Now you can do it with AI, but back then I would like sit in a dark edit bay and just hack away at the transcription. And eventually I knew the content better than he did. And I said, hey, Ken, do you mind if I like take a stab at the script, just to help you out? And he's like, yeah, sure. And so pretty like eventually I just started writing the scripts for the local documentaries. And they hired me while a student at USF as an assistant producer for Ken Sherry. And that was awesome. That's probably to date my favorite job ever. Like, because it was just so like liberating to just do whatever you wanted. And it was all like feel good documentaries that aired on TV. That was really awesome. But you know how budget cuts happen, and I graduated, and it was not the 2008 recession, but like back in 2003 there was a little recession, and so people started getting laid off from WUSF. And so I decided to do news, and I moved up to North Carolina to like the boonies, Greenville, North Carolina, and got a job as a camera operator, a photojournalist. So I did photojournalism for a while. And then I realized that I really liked the marketing guy's job, the guy that did all the promos for the station. So I started shadowing him, eventually got the promotion producer job. So I did the marketing for the news and for the station. Eventually moved over to Memphis, Tennessee, got another news job there. That was my last news job, because at that point I got burned out, a lot of people fade in news and eventually go somewhere else. And so it was my turn. And I got a job at a production company in Memphis. And really, I was just a producer. So my job was to go to the shoots and interview people and write scripts. But eventually, 8 years later, I became the creative director at that place. And that shop was awesome. That's probably my second favorite job, because I was producing commercials, both local, state, and a lot of corporate videos. But it's really neat. Let me show you. So I have four of these. These are regional Emmys. And like, I don't care, because this is not me that did this. This was like my team, But I mean, because I was producing and directing them, I get to keep the award, which is kind of not fair. But that happened during that job because I was creating commercials for broadcasts. And that was really, really cool too. I learned a lot. I learned because in news, I learned how to be curious and how to investigate. And then in that job, I learned how to be creative. And it was like working two sides of my brain at the same time. And then I decided to make a career move. I currently work at a software company here in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I'm in the UX department. Now, this is like something I've never done before, because my whole career has been broadcast. I've never done anything in digital before, but I knew that that's the way that the industry was moving to. And I wanted to make sure that I was a well-rounded creative, you know. It turns out I don't really love digital, but I've been doing it for like 4 years now. And so because I mean, it's a great job. I love my job. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't satisfy that creative itch. So I had to find something else that did, right? So, and that was if I could tell you anything that I've learned throughout my career is that for so long, and you guys are going to fall in this trap too. You want your career to be tied directly with your creativity, right? Like we are so lucky that we're going to be working in an industry that allows us to be creative, but it will never be 100% satisfying because somebody else is paying for it. Okay. So there's this like intersection of business and creative, commerce and creative, that at the end of the day, the person writing the check has to make those creative choices. And so it took me a long time to realize that I needed to decouple that. Work is work, creative is creative. You know, work could be creative, but this stuff is what's really satisfying. And that's when I really just wanted a creative outlet. I started a podcast. It was really just a way for me to get that stuff out. I never in my wildest dreams thought anybody would listen to it, or that it would be successful, or that it would have advertisers. You know what I mean? Like none of that. Like I never even took that into account when I did it. I just literally wanted to do something that was creative. And so the podcast that I started out in 2017 is called Pretend. And the concept is of people pretending to be someone else. And at first it was like an artsy fartsy podcast. It's about like ghost writers and actors and comedians, people who have to like assume a persona to go up on stage and like and perform. But then I found out that that's really boring. And so I met my cousin who is a con artist. And I was like, oh, well, he's pretending to be someone else too. Maybe I should talk to him. So I whipped up just my iPhone. Like I just sat next to him with the voice memo app. I mean, I told him I was recording. And I sat there for like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And he just told me all the crimes that he has ever committed in his life, because I knew he was a criminal, but I just didn't know. You know, it's like nobody talks about the details in the family. So this is like the first time I'm hearing all this stuff. And I was floored. And I go, that's the concept for Pretend. That it's people pretending to be someone else, but they're con artists. And it turned into a true crime show at that point. And so that was my first episode. That I had no plan. I was just like, I'm going to talk to my cousin, see what I get. And now I'm like, okay, well, now I need to come up with more ideas, right? And quickly too, because this thing is now out in the world, and I have this thing, and I gotta like come up with, generate ideas really fast. And so season 1 was just one big giant experiment. You know, every story I was trying to explore that angle of people pretending to be someone else. By season 2, I kind of understood what the show was about. You know, because the first season, I'm just trying to figure it out. The second season, and now I'm on season 7, and it's like muscle memory at this point. Like I know it's not a formula, but I know what to do. It's hard because I do it on my own, you know, like, so I think that's what you guys are wanting to talk about today, which is pitching ideas and like, there's different ways of pitching ideas. So like at work, when I'm with my marketing team and the UX team at Red Hat, I'm pitching ideas with not only multiple people, but multiple departments. Okay. And everybody has to buy into like, if I want my idea to win, I really got to sell it, because I got to convince a lot of people. For the podcast, I'm pitching ideas to myself, which is still the same process. It's just a lot more lonely. You know what I mean? But you still have to go through the same motions. So I use this thing called, for work, right? For the marketing team, we use this thing called a mirror board, MIRO. And I don't know if that's free or not, but I think it might be. But basically what it is, it's just a blank canvas. Imagine a whiteboard. It's a digital whiteboard where you could see other people in real time, like move their mouse and their cursor. And so what we have is like different ideas. So like we'll post videos from YouTube or Vimeo, or just an image that captures the idea. And then they have sticky notes, and we write sticky notes to kind of like, okay, so if you combine this image with this video and then this thought, that's my idea, right? And so then everybody in real time just starts throwing stuff on this board. And then when we're done, we start talking about each idea, and then we give everybody a break, and we're like, hey, why don't we let these ideas, like, let's read them again, and quietly, just us, go ahead and put a star next to the ideas that kind of resonates with you. So it's not just your idea, vote on other people's ideas. And now you start seeing the stars kind of clump up into certain ideas, and the good ideas start rising to the top. And then you go in and you refine that idea some more, now that the group is kind of coalescing with certain ideas. And that's kind of a technique called brain writing. I don't know where that came from, but brain writing is really, what I like about brain writing is that it's letting extroverts talk, and then it's letting introverts think. Okay, so the idea is that you go off to the side by yourself and you collect your thoughts. This is where the introverts really win, because they're kind of in their own space and they're writing their ideas. You could do this with Post-its, and then you post it on the wall and you talk about it. That's where the extroverts come in, because if you don't have some sort of creative pitching environment that allows for both types of thinkers to thrive, extroverts are going to take over every time. They're the loudest voice in the room. So what I like about that is that you have time to think about your idea without talking to somebody. Post it up somewhere, whether it's mirror board or an actual whiteboard, and then talk about it. And that seems to work out really well, because what's nice about that is that you knock out the obvious idea, because you'll notice that when you start putting stuff on the whiteboard or on the mirror board, that 5 other people had the same obvious idea. The obvious idea is never the best idea. So you could just eliminate that, and then by generating multiple ideas, like more than one idea, that's how you're getting to the really good idea. And you might have a half of an idea and somebody else has another half of an idea. And when they collide together, you have a really good idea. So that's the benefit of working with other people. Unfortunately for the podcast, I don't really have that, other than like friends and my wife and stuff. Like, I'll pitch to her ideas, like she doesn't even know, but we're having like dinner or something, and I'm like, oh, what about this and this, and depending on her reaction, whether she's interested in what I'm talking about or not, I kind of gauge whether like my audience would be interested in it. Because that's another thing. When you're pitching an idea, you also have to think about your audience. And for the podcast, my audience is women 25 to 45. That's what I'm imagining, And for work, my audience is geeky white guys. You know what I mean? So it's like, when you come up with ideas, you have to like make sure that you're writing ideas that resonate with that audience. There's another tool that I showed Kristen in her class last time she had me here, that I use a lot for my podcast, and it's called Trello, Trello. And what's really nice about that, and this is like something I use almost daily, is that it allows me to collect ideas, but also other people have access to my board if I wanted to collaborate with them. But so I have another podcast called Criminal Conduct now that I have a co-host. So we both are investigating cases all the time, and there's tons of ideas that are happening, right? So we have in Trello, there's a card there. It's a bunch of cards that you could move along the board. And the way I use it is to move it from idea to like, this is an idea. This is an idea that's actually happening. And then this now is an episode. And as the idea matures, I move it along that board. And that's a really good tool for me to work on, because I can keep track of my idea. Sometimes all your ideas aren't good. So if I have an idea, I just put it in Trello so I don't forget it. And it's always there. And I could always follow up. Even like a year later, I'd come back to that idea. I'm like, is this still a good idea? Sometimes you got to let those ideas kind of germinate and just sit there and become something. Sometimes they're not good right off the bat. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of my process. But yeah, I highly recommend all of you guys look into Miro, Miro, and look into Trello. So I don't know what you're seeing because I can't see myself. But so this is my, can you see my screen?
It's just white. It's very bright.
Oh,
Oh, there we go.
okay. So I don't know what you're saying, but
Yeah, I can see
this
it.
column right here is all my ideas. And these could be like hundreds of ideas. And if I click on that, well, I didn't click on a good one. There's an underwater Ponzi scheme. Obviously, I have nothing on that, but like if I had more, I would put notes in there. And I just keep track of my ideas there. And then I move the cards over to the reporting column when they start kind of becoming something, you know? But then when they're really a thing, I put them in the episode column. And I have a lot of notes on. So like, for instance, you see, I just write a description and I write notes and I keep track of like every phone call I make because, you know, I could be working on a story. A lot of my stories for pretend and for criminal conduct, if I started a episode today, it might not air for another 6 months. Most stories take 6 months to a year to actually like hatch, you know, it doesn't happen instantly. So my memory doesn't go that far. So I need Trello to help me like, okay, I contacted this person 2 months ago. They never responded. I should probably contact them again. You know, it's a good way of keeping track of your ideas. So there's this thing called pattern disruption. You want to like break up the monotone. Like I never want to have, I mean, there are moments where I have maybe 3 or 4 minutes of narration, and that's because I have to, because I don't have sound. I don't have like an interview or any clips to play or whatever. But for the most part, I like to keep my narration really short, and I like to have the interview really move the piece. But at the same time, you don't want people to ramble off and give off like information. The information is my job as a narrator, you know, so like where they're from, where they, you know, what their name is. I want every soundbite that the interview says to be emotional, to like really grab you. So what I do is I have this program. This is cool too. Write this down. It's called Descript, Descript, and it is like sorcery. Like it is the craziest thing. So I put my interview in the script, and the script transcribes it really pretty nicely. And that's not the part that is mind blowing, because there's a lot of artificial translations there, but it does a pretty good job, like maybe 95% correct. And what it does is that it's showing me now the words, you know, like the written transcription. And as I'm reading the transcription, I start crossing out the things that I don't like about that interview. And what I'm left with are usable sound bites. Okay. This is where the sorcery comes in. So if I grab a sound bite, like I just highlight the text, copy and paste it and move it to the beginning, Descript starts editing the audio file. That it is unbelievable. So I'm really writing a script, but as I'm writing the script, it's editing the audio file. So when I'm done with that script, I have an edited piece, not broadcast ready, but it is chopped up, and you can do this with video too. So I started a YouTube channel, and I used the script too for that, where I'm looking at just the transcription, and as I'm editing that transcription and adding narration to it, it's actually, when I add narration to it, it spaces out where the narration would be. So it's accurate to what it would sound like when I actually do my voiceover. And what's really cool about the script, this is another really wicked sorcery thing that it does. I read 10 minutes of The Wizard of Oz so that the script could learn my voice, and it uses deep fake technology. It actually uses my voice when I type in the narration. And so when I play it back, it's like, it's me, even though I've never recorded it, it's me reading the narration. And so I could have narration, soundbite, narration, soundbite. And when I'm done with this process, my episode is kind of assembled, and I could hand it over to my editor at that point and with my actual voiceover, and she just like replaces the AI narration with the real narration and like cleans up some edits, adds the music, bada bing, bada boom, it's done. So like my process when I first started Pretend, when I interviewed my con artist cousin, went from transcribing everything, like hours and hours of tape myself, to like, it was just such a long process. And Descript has cut that down for me, which is great because I'm a one-man band. But you could use it for video, you could use it for audio, and it's free too. But I use the paid version. And I can't remember why I pay for it. Like there's obviously more when you pay for it, but it's pretty mind blowing. Oh, there was something else before we move on into the creative stuff. Going back to the brainstorming and pitching. So I remember I have a friend who's a CFO, a chief financial officer at a technology company. And, financial people are like the most boring people on earth, right? Like they deal with numbers all the time. They're not creative at all. But he wanted me to give them like some sort of, like presentation on how to be more creative. And that was like a real challenge because financial people aren't creative. And so I started thinking about it. I was like, you know what? Just because they work in finance doesn't mean that they can't use problem solving skills just like we do in the creative world, right? And so I'm just reading through this. I haven't looked at this presentation in a long time, but if you don't have a creative team, morale is low, because people are just kind of going about their everyday. There's a dip in performance. You could like suffer low business, like you don't get new business, you could have recruitment issues. So there really is like a case to be made for being creative. And so I was talking to them about my favorite book ever, which you should read too. It's called Where Do Good Ideas Come From? It's by Stephen Johnson. Where do good ideas come from? And the book is about, it's not about what we do in broadcast, right? This guy's not a creative in the sense of like you and I, right? But this guy is talking about where do good ideas come from? So somehow sand was heated up by lightning and turned into glass, and somebody found it on the beach and was like, what do I do with this, right? Somebody made that glass, was able to recreate what lightning did by heating up that glass, made it clear. And then somebody else came around and got that glass and bent it, and it's like, oh, wait, we can magnify it. And then somebody else got two glasses and made eyeglasses, and then somebody else got two glasses and overlaid them and made magnification, a microscope, a telescope. And eventually we got to fiber optics, right? You couldn't come up with you couldn't invent fiber optics if it wasn't for that process had to happen, right? And he just cites example after example after example. And there's a really good one about Dyson, the company Dyson, and the way that they use their vacuum filter-free vacuum. Well, that idea seems revolutionary, except they got it from the cyclones at a sawmill. That's how they filter the air. Okay, so it's like, it wasn't like Dyson came up with that idea in a vacuum. They got inspired by something else, and something really like irrelevant from their field, right? Like a sawmill. So it's all about ideas colliding with one another. And when you're brainstorming, that's super important because you have to like not only, get inspiration from other creatives like you and I, like in broadcast, but also look outside your field too, because there might be like if something else that inspires you. So that book is really awesome. I would definitely read that. And then there's also this thing, my company got acquired by IBM. And even though that sounds like, IBM, big blue, big giant tech company, they actually have a really mature creative department. I mean, this company has been around for over 100 years, and like they take creativity very seriously. I mean, and the amount of career growth that you could have as creative in IBM is unbelievable. But they do this thing called design thinking. And the first stage of design thinking is define the problem. Like, what's the problem? And then the second stage is research. So then you got to research it. Third is ideate. It's what we were talking about, like the brainstorming, right? And then fourth is prototyping. You have to test that idea. Does it work? Test it, test it, test it. And then if it doesn't, start over again. And that's a process that we all do as creatives. It's just that this is a more formal way of doing it. And then the other technique, the last technique that I wanted to talk about that I think is really cool is a SWOT analysis board. So imagine if you have a square and then you draw a cross in that square, and then the upper left hand is like the really strong ideas, and the upper right is the really weak ideas. And then you, in the lower one, you could talk about like, where it could be better, and then the lower right could be the threats. And so if you start posting with Post-its your ideas on these squares, you start realizing what are the strongest ideas, because you start stress testing it. Like you start poking holes at the ideas, like, well, this idea is really cool, but it could also not work because of whatever reason. You put that in the weakness square, and so then as you start rating your ideas, you start realizing right away that which idea is the strongest. So if you ever have a doubt, how to test your idea, especially in a group when everybody gets married to their ideas, it's a good unbiased way of rating your ideas so that people don't get their feelings hurt. I remember this one writer I used to work with. I mapped the wedding song to my keyboard, because like I knew that every time she would come up with an idea and we didn't pick her idea, she would get really married to her idea. And so I would play the wedding march, and it would just break the tension in the room because she got married to her idea again. And it was like a running joke, you know what I mean? So it's like when you're creative, you get passionate about your ideas, but sometimes you have to let go of your idea, because sometimes your idea, even though you really like it, if it's not resonating with other people, maybe you should reconsider it, So that's really tough. That's a tough thing that comes with experience and maturity. And like mature creatives, when you criticize their ideas, they don't take it as personal anymore. I think that that's something that we all have to be really good at, is to not take criticism so personally. Because going back to what I said earlier in this meeting, is that when somebody else is paying for the idea, it's not yours. You're just an artist for hire, for pretend. You criticize my ideas for pretend, and I'll take that personally, because I'm fully in control of that, right? But then at the same time, I don't care if you don't like it, because it's my idea, it's my art, right? But for work, it's like, if my boss doesn't like the idea, or my coworkers don't like the idea, I have to kind of let go sometimes. And I have to say that most of the time my idea is not the best idea, and I'm okay with that, but it takes a long time to come to that point. So after my cousin, the con artist story, I was looking for another story idea, because I had to come up with something. And I found this cult in Western North Carolina. So I live in North Carolina, and I'm like, I just wanted something that was nearby, right? That I could actually go in person and all that. And I found this cult, and they're really crazy. And I started doing research on it. And when those episodes came out, boom, it blew up. Like there was no smooth transition or anything like that. The podcast just kind of took off because people really, really liked that. And it was kind of a story that was active. It wasn't like I was telling a story that something that happened a long time ago. In fact, I'm working on an episode about that cult now. I did a whole season after that. So like I did a couple episodes on this cult. People liked it so much, and I went back and did a whole 11 episodes on this cult. And I got so involved with this cult that they actually invited me in. I was like the only journalist who has ever been invited to this church. And the cult leader, they had this screaming prayer where they don't scream words. They scream like, I'm not going to replicate it here because I'll blow your eardrums, but it's like this howl, and everybody has like a different signature scream, but it's basically like, ah, and they scream to your face. And it's a way of exercising the demons. It's like, like demonic possession, like they're trying to free you from the demons, and they'll even take babies, like little babies that cry. You know how babies cry? They scream at these babies because they think that the devil is what's making them cry. They hold them down and scream them. It's really nuts. And so once I did that story, the podcast kind of blew up there. And, even now I feel like I'm still a medium-sized podcast. So it's really successful and I make money off of it, but it has become so competitive out there that, I feel like when I started it, I entered right when the window was about to close, because when I started Pretend, these big networks weren't doing podcasts. Like Dateline didn't have a podcast. Right before I started, if you had a really good idea and you made it into a podcast, you could be big, right? But like now you're fighting against Spotify and big companies like Wondery. And so it's a real challenge even still. But that being said, I think I'm still within the top 5% of all podcasts out there, because there's so many podcasts, but it's pretty successful. I've been written about in the New York Times, BBC, Variety, I don't know, like a bunch of places, but it's kind of funny when that kind of exposure happens. I actually don't see a bump in numbers. It's the most frustrating thing. I was like, I've been in the New York Times and didn't get any bump. But then I'll release like some random episode and that does well. So who knows? So I was telling Kristen before we hopped on the call, Kristen and I were talking, I was telling her that I was just in St. Augustine, Florida a couple of weeks ago, filming an episode for a Discovery ID show that they are doing it after my second podcast, which is called Criminal Conduct. And the reason why I started a second podcast was because Pretend is more episodic. It's like one topic and the next episode is a different topic. And I wanted to keep it that way. But I wanted to try a long format podcast out where I could just do one story for the entire season. And I felt that was more appropriate as its own podcast. And what we did was we covered a case down in Florida where this young girl dies from a gunshot wound. Her boyfriend is a deputy sheriff, and it's highly suspicious because the people who came to investigate, the detectives in the sheriff's office, were obviously coworkers of this guy, and they didn't do a thorough investigation. And so they said it was a suicide. But if you look at the evidence, it's pretty clear that that it's not. I mean, it could be a murder too. It could be a homicide, but they didn't investigate it that way. And so what we did was we tried to dig up new information. And as we were investigating, this other guy, this private citizen who was looking into the case, he gets murdered. So basically the podcast is we're investigating the murder of this guy who was investigating the murder or the possible murder of this other girl. And it was nuts. And so Discovery ID wanted to do an episode on that. And so we just shot it down in St. Augustine. That I would have never imagined when I was interviewing my cousin that I would be doing any of this stuff. But the bad news is that even though it sounds really cool, I still have to have a day job, right? Because it pays, but it's hobby money, right? Like it's not like quit your job money. Although some people have quit their jobs. I just haven't gotten there yet. If I would have jumped into this thing thinking that I was going to be able to quit my job and look, it's been like almost 4 years and I can't quit my job. I mean, I play life a little bit more cautious than some people, so I'm more on the be an apprentice, like dip your toes into it, see what you're getting into before you make such a dramatic life change. But then there's also like a lot of reward into just jumping in, I'm just not that type of guy. But I know people who have. Like I was just talking to a friend of mine who has a pretty, not as a successful podcast as mine, but I know that she's going places and she feels it too. And so she quit her job. She's putting it all in on the table. But that's a personal decision. I'm not brave enough to do it, but I always say, before you try something, if you're interested in documentaries, find a local documentarian that needs help, and see if it's for you, or if you're interested in podcasts, do that. But then you got all these YouTubers, right? That are posting what they're eating for breakfast and they're millionaires. So like, who am I to say not to just jump in, you know? Because you never know what works. I think that's a gut decision, you know? Well, the YouTube thing is really new. I just started it. I only have like 200 subscribers and it's terrifying. And no, I don't enjoy it at all. Like, yeah, I'm much more comfortable like behind the microphone than I never wanted to be, even when I worked in news. Like, I never wanted to be a reporter. Like, I had no desire to be in front of the camera ever. The whole podcast thing, the only reason why I'm doing it is because I don't know anybody else has enough time to voice it for me. You know what I mean? Like, it's just easier for me to do it. But if I could remove myself from like the talent part, I would totally do that. But I'm trying out the YouTube thing because it's like the #2 search engine. I have a lot of interesting guests come on my show, and a lot of times I record on Zoom. Like, you know, we'll do like something similar to this, but Zoom, I'm only using the audio of it, but it's actually recording the video too. So I'm thinking I have all this video content that's just sitting there. And so I'm just trying it out and seeing where it goes. I like for most of the show to not have music, but when you hear it, it's like it hits you, you know, like you really feel it. And I like to do it right when I'm transitioning to another thought. So usually under my voiceover, my editor puts it under the interview and then leaves my voiceover without music. So it's like not that one is right versus the other. It's just a different approach. But I definitely like to use music intentionally. I don't want you to be distracted by it. In fact, I don't know about you guys, but when you watch a movie or a TV show, I'm sure you're analyzing the production because you guys understand it, right? But you eventually get caught up in the story, and then you forget about the production becomes invisible. But try to listen to a show and try to listen to when that music goes away. They do it so carefully and so smoothly that you don't even notice it. And so that's kind of what I'd like to do with music. I like to make it disappear so that you're already wrapped up in the story. And if I do a good job, hopefully you don't even notice it. For sound effects, I use it sparingly. So with video, actually the podcast has made me a better writer than when I was in video, because in video you could cheat. You don't have to like describe a room. You can just see it, right? You just show people your environment. So you show and you don't tell. Well, in audio, we don't have that luxury. You have to tell. And so now I'm like trying to force my brain of like, how do I take you to the same place that I went to? How do I take you to this church? You know, this cult. You know, like how do I take you to a swamp that I'm doing an interview or something like that. I'm making that up. But, you know, and that's where the sound effects come in. It's like I try to capture nat sounds if I'm recording in the field. But if I don't, like I did this episode. Okay, here's another Kristen story. So I'm sure she made you do a chase scene at some point in your class. And like that was my favorite assignment. And I feel like I didn't do a good job. And my whole career, I've been trying to like do a good chase scene, and it finally happened, but it wasn't on video. It was with audio. And I did this episode for Pretend called the Norco Bank Robberies, or I think it's Norco, Norco. I don't know what I called it. It's been a couple of years now, but it was a bank heist in California. And that was my chase scene, because I wanted you to feel like those cops that responded to that bank robbery. The robbers robbed the bank, and they escaped, and there was a long chase from a suburb in Los Angeles all the way to the mountains. And I wanted you to be in that car, you know, with that cop. But I also get annoyed when podcasters put police sirens, like, because that freaks me out. If I'm driving and I hear a police siren in a podcast, I think, you know, that I'm in trouble or whatever. So that was a challenge. So it's like, how do I take you and be a passenger in that cop's car, knowing that there's a shootout, there's guns everywhere, there's sirens, obviously, helicopters flying up in the air. So I wanted you to take you there, but without a siren. And so anytime you would hear a siren in the show, it came from the inside of a car. So it was like really muffled and in the distance. I buried it, but it was there. The gunshots. I mean, that whole episode for me was like a good exercise in bringing an audience there. So I would check that out because that was like, but I don't do that every time. But it was a good way of like showing action. Well, I definitely think that the journalism degree is what gets you your first job. After that, I don't think it matters anymore, right? I mean, unless you came from like, I don't know. But I think the journalism degree gets you your first job. I can only tell you from my experience, I got that job in PBS and that was cool, but I don't think I would have ever been able to start out in Tampa. So what I did was I started in a small market, is big fish in a small pond type of thing. And the way I moved up wasn't by staying in one place, but really by just moving around, just moving to the next, because the grass is always greener. People would rather hire somebody from somewhere else and promote them than give promotion to somebody who's worked their ass off, their entire time at the same place. And all podcasts are different, right? Like, so mine is a storytelling podcast, but there's like interview podcasts, there's like discussion podcasts, there's 2-minute podcasts, there's like a podcast that I listen to. It's called something. I forget, but it's like a sound podcast, and they just like play a really cool, interesting sound for 2 minutes, and that's it. So there's like, there's so many things that you can do with podcasting. It's kind of ironic that I didn't take any of the advertising classes, and I work in advertising. So like, but if I could go back, I would probably take some of those advertising classes, but I didn't know that back then. And I think that you shouldn't be so hard on yourself now, because you don't know where your career is going to take you, right? But you should cast like a wide net and see, like, I want to go in this direction and aim for that direction, but know that your career is going to zigzag. It's just going to zigzag. You just never know where you're going to go.
So I want to start a podcast. I got a whole entire mic and everything because I'm really serious about it. Do you feel like it's important to have like an intro and an outro? Like, there is also, when I was doing research on podcasts, I feel like there's also like technical things that people were saying you should do to be successful. And I wanted to know if you feel like all that stuff really matters.
Oh, good. That's awesome. That's a really good question, actually. Don't get obsessed with technology. You're going to go crazy trying to get the biggest, greatest mic. Nobody cares. Like, seriously, nobody cares. This device has a great microphone. You could literally make a podcast from your phone. And what's cool about it is that as long as it's audible and people understand it, who cares? You know what I mean? The important thing is to get started. The intro outro thing I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is such a booby trap for people who want to start podcasting. The way you start a conversation with somebody, like, let's say you're interviewing somebody. I'm interviewing Kristen, and I'm like, hey, Kristen, how's it going? Oh, and we have chit chat for like 10 minutes. Nobody wants to hear that. Okay, it's very interesting for me and Kristen, but nobody else wants to hear that. So that's why it's really important, even if you have an interview podcast where it sounds like it's unedited, it's edited. Okay, take all that garbage out. Nobody wants to hear the chit chat. Get to the meat. I'll give you so Ira Glass is like one of my heroes. He's from the host of This American Life. He has this like formula for telling stories, and this could be telling stories or doing interviews, but it's called the lowercase e. Okay. And the reason why is because you start with the most important thing, the most captivating thing, the thing that will slap people and get their attention. And then you tell that story, and then you go back until you get back to that point again. And that's a much more interesting way of telling a story than starting from the beginning. Usually the beginning is not very interesting. Like, if you're telling me about this person's career and I'm like, what's the point? Like, I don't even know why I'm listening. Get to the point, get to the most interesting stuff first. And start a podcast. Let me tell you something that, like, if you want to start a podcast, especially for me, I'm Hispanic, and this field is filled with nerdy, white, nasally guys, you know what I mean? Which is great, but voices like mine aren't heard, right? And voices like yours aren't heard. And so I use my podcast to tell stories that only I could tell. So I did a story about Santeria, which is a Afro-Cuban religion, that if any of you are from Miami, you would know about it. Like, but the rest of the world doesn't know about it. And I have a podcast. I could tell the world about it. And if you have a unique story, this is the most democratizing uh, medium there is. You have all the tools right here, and you can just do a podcast. It's really like easier than it sounds. The hard part is actually sticking to it and actually following through and delivering it. Apple had just created podcasting, but with no business model behind it. It was just like, oh, this is just something that you could do. It's like an RSS feed, a fancy RSS feed. Anybody who throws our RSS feed could have a podcast. But now it's becoming a business, right? And people like big players are moving in. And so Amazon just got in the game. And so they're gobbling up podcasts, and Spotify's in the game and they're gobbling up podcasts. So like now I have a friend who has a podcast called Disgraceland. Disgraceland. It's a true crime rock and roll. Really good show. Way more successful than mine. Amazon just bought him, and so now his podcast is only available exclusively on Amazon. Last Podcast on the Left got gobbled up by Spotify. A lot of this stuff is happening right now where it used to be this one big platform, this big happy place, and now it's becoming competitive. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with little guys like me, like, where do I go? Because Amazon hasn't called me and Spotify hasn't called me. So like, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see what happens in like the next 5 years. Just be humble, learn from other people, and do stuff. Like the worst thing that you could do is have a great idea and not do it, like just letting it rot in the vine, on the vine. I mean, like, just if you have an idea, do it, and don't set high expectations for the idea. You're going to accomplish the idea if you just do it and don't expect anything from it. Like pretend like I didn't think about it or think about like advertisers and all that stuff. I just did it. And look, I just rode the wave, right? And so just do that. Like have a creative outlet. And you know what? When I hire people now for my other job, and even my current employees, I tell my employees who are designers, they're web designers, I say, keep your portfolio up to date. Not because I want you to get another job. I want to keep them. But their portfolio is their pride. That's who they are. And that work could be work that they're doing for me at the company, or that could be work that they're doing because I have an employee who does like handwriting, like hand lettering. Put that stuff out there, put it together, because that is your pride. And always have a sharp portfolio, a living, breathing portfolio. No matter what, if you have a job, if you're a student, your portfolio is going to impress me more. I don't care about what school you came from. All I'm looking at is your portfolio. And if your portfolio shows creativity, it doesn't need to be relevant work. It just needs to be, I need to say, damn, this person is a creative and I want them. There have been several times where I've hired people when I was not even looking for people, because they shot me their portfolio and I'm like, damn, that's a good catch. I got to get that person. You know what I mean? Because when you see a real, true creative, you don't want to let them go, And so that's where you should put all your energy behind. It's a portfolio of whatever, but cool shit. Just put it out there.